We continue now at the top of Daf Yudalad Amar Aleph and Meseches Bava Kamma. This is Bava Kamma Daf 14a. On the previous summit, the Gemara brought a brisa which said that if a shore is in the possession of a shoel or a shomer sacher, some kind of watchman, and it does damage, so if it's a tam, it pays chatzi nezik. If it's a muad, it pays nezik shalim. And the Gemara wanted to clarify what exactly is the case, and the Gemara suggested maybe the case is that the ox of the lender actually does damage to the ox of the borrower, and we're saying that the lender has to pay in that situation. But the Gemara said that doesn't make any sense, because in general, let's say a shoel borrows an animal, he's responsible for any animal that damage does, so why should the mashil be responsible? And the Gemara answers, no, that really is the case, but it's a particular situation where the shoel velo kibel olav shmiras nezakav. He takes upon himself to watch over the animal, to protect the animal, but he does not accept any damages that the animal does. That still is the responsibility of the mashil. And Rashi explains, V'lo kibel olav shmiras nezakav. Again, he doesn't accept upon himself watching over any damages. If that animal, the mashil's animal, damages others, again, the shoel doesn't take that responsibility, and that's why the brisa said that the mashil is going to have to pay chatzi nezik if it's a tam, and he has to pay nezik shalem if it is a muad. But the Gemara continues, if so. Let's look at the end of the very same brisa. Nifritza belaylo shepartzu listim, and this we quoted on the previous summit. If again the fence opens in the middle of the night, or robbers open up the fence, v'yatzta v'hizika, and then it goes out and it does damage, so then we say pater. So then in that situation we say pater, and so that implies habiyom chayiv. That implies that if this would happen in the middle of the day, so then he would be chayiv. But why should the shoel be chayiv in such a case? Halo kibel olav shmiras nezakav. Again, you're saying we're talking in a situation where the shoel did not accept upon himself the damages that are done by that animal. Meaning to say, the point of the brisa seems to be that if something happens that's out of his control in the middle of the night, or the robbers go ahead and they undo the fence, and then it goes out and damages, only then we say the shoel is pater. That implies that in general he's chayiv. But we just said the cases where the shoel did not take upon himself responsibility for any damages that this borrowed animal does. And the Gemara says, Hachi Kamar, you have to say this is what the brisa means to say. Im kibel olav shmiras nezakav. The brisa reads as follows. If you're in a situation not like what we said above, if you're in a situation where he did accept upon himself any damages that are done by that animal, so chayiv, then of course he will be chayiv for those kind of damages. However, nifritza belaylo shepartzu listim, let's say something happens in the middle of the night, that the fence is opened up, or there are robbers that open up the fence, things that are out of his control, v'yatzta v'zik, and then it goes out and it does damage, so then pater, then we're going to say that he is pater. But the Gemara continues, Ini, is it really true what Rebbe Elazar said on the previous summit? Again, on the previous summit, Rebbe Elazar said, if you have a property that's owned by both the mazik and the nizik, then the mazik does not need to pay. Rav Chisda disagreed on the previous summit. He said the mazik does need to pay in a situation of a property that's owned by both of them. But is Rebbe Elazar's, what Rebbe Elazar said, really true? V'atani Rav Yosef, but didn't Rav Yosef teach, Chatzer hashutfim v'hapunduk, let's say you have a chatzar that belongs to partnership, or punduk, Rashi will explain in a moment, but the point is, if it's a chatzar of shudfim, so chayiv bohen ala shein v'ala regel. You're chayiv there by shein and regel. That's exactly the opposite of what Rebbe Elazar said. Tiyufta de Rebbe Elazar, should we suggest that this is a refutation of Rebbe Elazar? But the Gemara says to that, Amar lach Rebbe Elazar will say to you, v'tizbara, but is that even logical? Masnisa milo pligi, isn't there a machlokas among brises? And therefore that's going to be the answer of Rebbe Elazar. But Rashi explains, V'hapunduk, what's punduk? Bayis gadol sheregilin orchim v'achnesoin lolin bo. That means to say a large house where you have a lot of guests that are staying over there. V'im hizik zeh. Let's say there's damage one to the other. Chayiv hashein v'regel. If that damage happens in terms of shein and regel, animals eating property or stepping on property, so then it's going to be chayiv. V'lo havek Rosh Hashanah. It's not considered like Rosh Hashanah. Normally we say shein and regel in Rosh Hashanah are pater, but that's not the case over here. Because since this area isn't designated specifically for the people of Rosh Hashanah, only for those who live there, that's called sada acher, because they're all renting, they're all paying to live over there, and that's why we say over there again, in that situation, it's just like shutfim, and we're going to say chayiv, but again, it seems to be a question on Rebbe Elazar, and Rebbe Elazar will answer that no, doesn't it seem anyway, there's a machlokas in brises, v'tizbra de masnisa lo pligi, de leka brisa de koi kavasi, you think there's no brisa that follows me, that by shutfin it's pater, v'atanya dalet klolos v'chulu, but we have the following brisa, and the Gemara continues, Vatanya, but didn't we learn in a brisa? Arba klalos hay Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer ben Izak, and there are 4 rules that Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar has when it comes to damages. damages. Kol shu reshus lenizik v'lo lemazik chay bakol. Let's say it's the property of the nizik where the damage occurs, and it's not the property of the mazik, so then he's chayiv in everything. The mazik v'lo lenizik, pater mikol, if it's the property of the mazik and not the nizik, totally pater. Lozev v'lozev, let's say it's a joint property. Could go in chaser hashutfim v'habikol, let's say we're talking about a chaser that belongs to shutfim, to partners, or a bikkur, an area that's a plain or a valley, so pater ba la shein v'ala regel, so then when it comes to shein and regel, it will be pater. That's exactly what Rebbe Lazar said. That's why this brisa is consistent with Rebbe Lazar. Al hanegicha v'al hanegifa v'al haneshicha. But when it comes to negifa, let's say negicha meaning goring, negifa pushing, neshicha biting, v'al ravitza v'al abita, if he's crouching upon and does damages, kicking and does damages, these are all kinds of intentional damages that the animal does, similar to keren. So in such situations, tam mishalim chatzi nezek. If it's a tam, is going to pay chatzi nezek, and muad mishalim nezek shalim. And if it's a muad, it's going to pay nezek shalim. And lola zev v'lola zev. Now let's say it's a property that doesn't belong to either. Could go in chatzir she'eno shel shneim. It's a chatzir, but it doesn't belong to either of them. So then chayebo al hashein v'al regel al hanegicha v'al haneshicha v'al hanegifa v'al ravitza v'al abita. Then you're going to be chayiv on all of these things, on shein and regel, and on goring and biting and pushing and crouching and kicking. Tam mishalim chatzi nezek. The tam will pay chatzi nezek as usual, and muad mishalim nezek shalim, and the muad will pay nezek shalim. And so the Gemara says katani mias, but what do we see nevertheless in this brisa? Chatzar hashutfin v'habika pater bala shein v'ala regel. It says that if you have a chatzar that belongs to partners or the valley, you're going to be pater by shein and regel. As we said, that's consistent with Rebbe Lazar. But the Gemara still says kashya hadadi. But don't you have here a contradiction within brisas? How do we answer the contradiction in brisas? And the Gemara says kitanya he. What was that brisa talking about? B'chatzar miyuchedes lozev v'lozev. We're talking about a chatzar that's designated for this one and for this one. Bein lepeiros, bein l'shvarim. Whether we're talking about for fruits or whether we're talking about for oxen. But the Gemara continues, Ahid Rav Yosef, that brisa of Rav Yosef that seems to say chayiv and seems to go against Rebbe Lazar, b'chatzar miyuchedes lepeiros ve'ena miyuchedes l'shvarim. That's talking about a chatzar where you're allowed to have peiros there, but it's not an area where you're supposed to bring oxen. The lagabe shein have a chatzar anizik. So with regards to any damage that the ox does, that he eats the fruits in terms of shein, then it is considered chatzar anizik, and the person, the mazik, is going to be responsible. And the Gemara says dekanam. We can bring a proof to this as well, that there's a distinction. These two areas are not exactly the same. The katani hacha dumya de pundak, because in the brisa of Rav Yosef, where it says that the person is chayiv, what also does it say? It says the chatzar hashutfin and a pundak. A pundak is an area where you don't normally bring an ox, and that's why the mazik is going to be chayiv. The katani hasam dumya de bika. But this other brisa which says that you're pater by chatzar hashutfim, what does it say? It says chatzar hashutfim is pater, and also bika, also an area like a plain or a valley is pater. That's an area where you normally do bring oxen, and it makes sense to say pater in that case, because again, it's got to be a chatzar hashutfin dumya de bika. Shema minan. The Gemara says, indeed, you see that's the case. That is the resolution of these brises, and that's how Rebbe Lazar can answer as well. It depends what kind of chatzar hashutfim we're talking about. And Rashi explains, Kitanya he the potter, the brisa which says potter by shein v'regel by a chatzar hashutfim, b'chatzar miyuchedes lazev v'lazev. That's a chatzar that everyone's allowed to bring everything in. You can bring peiros in, you can bring shvarim in, lepeiros v'leshvarim. Dahavel a chatzar hashutfim legabe shein. That's considered a chatzar hashutfim legabe shein, or legabe keren, and also legabe keren. But hilkach b'shein potter b'rishos harabim. That's considered like almost like a rishos harabim, and shein is potter rishos harabim. Uv'keren tam a chatzi nezek b'rishos harabim mishalim. But a keren that's a tam does pay chatzi nezek and rishos harabim. So meaning to say, if you have a chatzar hashutfin and they're both partners are allowed to bring everything in there, that's rishos harabim in terms of the halachas of shein v'regel, and that's why it's potter. That's how we explain that brisa. With Rav Yosef b'chatzar miyuchedes, but again by Rav Yosef we're talking about an area where you're not supposed to bring oxen, even though maybe they're both bringing their fruits in there. To have a chatzar hanizik shelo hayol lahachnes sham shvarim, that's already considered chatzar hanizik because you shouldn't bring in your ox. V'lo dami l'rishos harabim, it's not similar to rishos harabim. And pundak einu miyuchad l'shvarim, a pundak also, it's not a place where you bring oxen. Because there you have business, the things, the items that people are selling, the businessmen. They don't want their vessels to get damaged, and so therefore they don't want oxen to come there. And stam bika also, if you have a valley, in most normal valleys or plains, roim sham shvarim, those are areas where the oxen they graze. But the Gemara continues, Maskefla Rabbi Zeir. Rabbi Zeir asks the following question, Kaven de miyuchedes leperos, but still, since you have an area, let's say, that's designated that the partners are both allowed to bring their fruits, haba'inanu bir b'stei acher v'leka, but doesn't it need to be bir b'stei acher? It has to be another person's field. Isn't that lacking in this situation because they're both partners, they're both allowed to use the field? But the Gemara says, Amarle Abai said to him, Kaven de'ena miyuchedes l'shvarim, since it's not designated that oxen, meaning oxen are not supposed to go there, so sada acher karina bay, that's called Sada Acher. That's a situation where the ox is going in another field, a field that the ox is not supposed to be in, and that's why there's a responsibility to pay damages. But the Gemara continues, Amalei Rav Acha midifti lo Ravina, but now Rav Acha midifti says to Ravina, Lema midemasnisa lo pligi, Amoroi nami lo pligi. But 1 second, if we're already saying that the brises don't argue, because we're resolving the contradiction in brises by saying that there's different kinds of partnerships, different kinds of property, so if that's the case, so Amoroi nami lo pligi, let's say that the Amoraim are also not arguing. We said that there's a machlokas Amoraim between Rabbi Elazar and Rav Chisda in a situation of Chatzar HaShutfin, whether Chayev or Pater. Rabbi Elazar says Pater, Rav Chisda says Chayev, but maybe they're not arguing. Maybe they're talking about different scenarios. Amar Lei said to him, yes, that's exactly right. They're talking about different scenarios. V'im Tim Salomer, but if you want, you could say also, Pligi Bekushya de Rabbi Zera, Uveperuka di Abaya Pligi. They're arguing in terms of the question of Rabbi Zera and in terms of the answer of Abaya. And Rashi says, Amoroi nami lo pligi. Again, let's say the Amoraim are not arguing. Simply say, when Rav Chisda says chayev, we're talking about where oxen are not supposed to be there. With Rabbi Elazar, and Rabbi Elazar is talking about where it's designated that the oxen are allowed to be there. And the Gemara says it's possible that they're not arguing, but it's also possible they're arguing within the question of Rabbi Zera and the answer of Abaya. Rashi explains, because Rabbi Zera peruka de Abayu v'chotzer hamyuchedes lepeiros v'lo l'shvarim. Let's say you have a chotzer again that's designated for peiros and not for oxen. So that is again, it's sort of, is it sada acher or is it not? That was a discussion we just had in the Gemara. Rav Chisda ka'Abaya. Rav Chisda is going to follow Abaya in that situation, and he's going to say the kevan de einam yuchedes l'shvarim, since the oxen are not supposed to be there. Sada Acher Karina Bay, that's called Sada Acher, and we say you're responsible. However, Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Elazar will follow Rabbi Zera and say, no, that's not true. Kevin de Yesh Lamazik Rishus Bo Leperos, if the Mazik is able to put his fruits there, Lo Karina Bay Stay Acher, that's not called Stay Acher, and therefore you're not going to be responsible. So maybe they are arguing in this situation where you have a Chatzar where you can bring in Peiros, where they can both bring in Peiros, but they can't bring in oxen. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, Gufa, returning to what we said above. Arba Klolos Hayir Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer ben Izakin. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar has 4 rules when it comes to damages. Kolshu Rishus Lenizik V'lo Lamazik. Any area that's the property of the Nizik but not the Mazik, Chayiv Bakol. So he's Chayiv on everything. And the Gemara says Al Hakol Lo Katani. It doesn't say it's Chayiv on everything. El Chayiv Bakol, but rather it says Chayiv Bakol. What does that mean with the letter base? It means to say Bekule Nezik. What it means to say is you have to pay the entirety of the damage. Meaning money. Who is the author of this? Meaning who is he following? Who's Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar following when he says this? Rabbi Tarfon. He is following Rabbi Tarfon. Do Amar Mishuna Keren b'Chatzar HaNizik. Because Rabbi Tarfon says that if, let's say you have Keren, but you're in the Chatzar of the Nizik, so there, even though normally by a time you pay Chatzi Nezik, but Nezik Shalim Mishalim, but in that case you have to pay Nezik Shalim if the damage actually happens in the property of the Nizik where that animal was not supposed to be, so then you have to pay Nezik Shalim, and that's exactly what we're saying over here. We're saying if you have a Rishus Lenizik V'lo Lamazik Chayiv Bakol, you have to pay for all damages, you have to pay Nezik Shalim, even though it's a tam. But the Gemara says if we're following Rabbi Tarfon in that part of this rule, so Ema Sefer, let's look as the rules go on, let's look at the end. Lo Lazeh V'lo Lazeh. It says, let's say it doesn't belong to anybody. Could go in Chatzar She'eno Shel Shneim. Let's say it's a Chatzar that doesn't belong to any of them. Chayiv Ba'ala Shein Ve'ala Regel. Then you're Chayiv on Shein and Regel. And so the Gemara says, My Lo Lazeh V'lo Lazeh. But what does it mean that it's property that doesn't belong to any of them? Ilema lo lazeh v'lo lazeh klal. If you're going to say it means that the mazik and the nizik, both of them have no business being in this property at all. Ela da'acher, rather, belongs to some third party entirely. So v'habayina uvir b'stei acher v'leka. But as we just said above, in order to be chai by shein and regel, it has to be bir b'stei acher. And now you don't have bir b'stei acher in this situation. This is completely the property of a third party. So ela pshita, rather, what does it mean? What's obvious that it means? Lo lazeh v'lo lazeh ela dechad. Rather, what it means is it doesn't belong to this one and this one. It only belongs to one of the two of them, meaning to say it only belongs to the nizik. You have to interpret this line as saying also it's the property of the nizik, identical to the earlier line. But Katani Seif, and yet it says over here at the end, it says Tam Mishalim Chatzi Nezik, Umur Mishalim Nezik Shalim. It says that a Tam pays Chatzi Nezik in this case, and Umur pays Nezik Shalim, even though it's Bechatzar HaNizik. Apparently we're not following Rabbi Tarfon. Asan l'Rabbanan, it seems to follow the Rabbanan. The Amri Mishuna Karen Bechatzar HaNizik, Chatzi Nezik, Hu de Mishalim. The Rabbanan say when you have Karen in the Chatzar HaNizik, you're only going to pay Chatzi Nezik. nezek. So Reisha Rabbi Tarfon v'Sefer Rabbanan, you're going to say that the beginning of the Bryce is Rabbi Tarfon and the end is the Rabbanan. And the Gemara says, yes, that's exactly correct. To Amar le Shmuel Rav Yehuda, because Shmuel said to Rav Yehuda, Shinana Shvok Masnisin v'Toa Basra. He said Shinana. Shinana was a nickname for Rav Yehuda. Some say Shinana referred to the fact that he had long teeth. Some say it referred to the fact that he was sharp. But he said, abandon the Mishnah and follow me, Reisha Rabbi Tarfon v'Sefer Rabbanan. That the Reisha of this Bryce follows Rabbi Tarfon and the Seifa is the Rabbanan. And Rashi explains, Meshuna Karen b'chatzar anizik nezik shalom meshalim. Again, according to Rabbi Tarfon, if you have Karen b'chatzar anizik, it pays full. What Meshuna means over here is Karen Tama, basically means Tam. V'chol toldos and anything similar to Karen Tam, any of the toldos, Kari Meshuna, that's always just called Meshuna. However, Veshinu as vestin shelo hayu darkan lakach, because it was a strange kind of damage. It wasn't normal for this Tam to do that kind of damage. But then as the Brisa goes on, el da'achar, you're going to say we're talking about someone else's property, a third person's property. She'eno lo nizik v'lo mazik, the damage happened in a property that wasn't the nizik or the maziks. V'katani chayev ala shein, then you're going to say chayev and shein. That's not true. V'habayinan steyacher, as we said, it needs to be steyacher, it needs to be the nizik's property. Ala dechan minayu, so rather you'll say it's one of theirs. Kolomar the nizik, you'll say it's the nizik's property. But then again, we have a contradiction in the nizik's property. Do you pay full or do you not pay full when it comes to a tam? Ha'amar le Shmuel Rav Yehuda l'kamon chamisha tamin. So Shmuel said to Rav Yehuda, shvok masnisin, meaning lo titrach l'shnui kachat tana. Leave aside the mission as a way of saying, don't worry about having it all be like one tana. V'to'av asroi, and instead follow me. Ve'ema kavasi, say like I say. D'uki no reisha Rabbi Tarfon v'sefer Rabbanan. I say the beginning is Rabbi Tarfon, the end is the Rabbanan. V'dalid klolos to come Rabbi Shimon trei minayo b'chad duchta chad Rabbi Tarfon v'chad Rabbanan. And these two, when Rabbi Shimon says these four rules, so two of them in one place, one was like Rabbi Tarfon and one was like the Rabbanan. Meaning to say, in one point he's following according to the rules how it would go according to Rabbi Tarfon, and at one point he was following how the rules would go according to the Rabbanan. And the Gemara continues, Ravina Mishmei de Rava Amar, Ravina says in the name of Rava Kula Rabbi Tarfon, actually all of the rules of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, they all follow Rabbi Tarfon's shita. Umay lo lazev lo lazen. What does it mean when the Brisa goes on to say that the property doesn't belong to either of them? It means lo lazev lo lazel lepeiros ela dechad. It means as far as fruit, it doesn't belong to both of them. It only belongs to the nizik. It only belongs to one of them. But lazev lazel l'shvarim. But in terms of oxen, they're both actually allowed to bring their oxen in. And in such a situation, the lagabe shein have a lachatzer nizik. As far as shein is concerned, it's the property of the nizik, and therefore he's responsible to pay. But lagabe karen have a l'rishus harabim. But as far as karen is concerned, since the oxen are both allowed to be there, so that's considered to be like a rishus harabim, and you're going to follow all of the rules of rishus harabim. But the Gemara says, "Ihachi, if so, arba shalosh havi." If you're going to say that, aren't we down to really 3 rules? It's not actually going to be 4 rules. And the Gemara says, Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, and Rashi explains, Ela dechad the nizik. Rather, in terms of peiros, it only belongs to the nizik. The lagabe shein have a chatzar nizik, because as far as shein is concerned, it's considered the chatzar nizik. V'chayiv hamazik b'nizkei shein, and therefore the mazik is going to be chayiv in any of the damages of shein that happen. Shari lagabe peiros and ela nizik, because as far as the fruits are concerned, this is the property of the nizik. Well, lagabe karen have a rishus harabim, but in terms of karen, it's going to be considered rishus harabim. Shari b'rishus hichnis sham shora, because he was allowed to have his ox over there. That's why he pays chatzi nezek and no more. But the Gemara says, according to this explanation, gimel klolas have, it's actually not really 4 rules, it's only 3 rules. The high klola basra, because this last rule over here, this is the rule of the lo lazev lo lazeh that we're now interpreting as one person having the peiros and both having the rights to have shvarim there. Shamina le mikamoi, we actually learned this last rule out from the earlier rules. Because if you're already interpreting that in this case, as far as Shane is concerned, it's the chatzar hanizah because he's the only one that has the rights to put fruits there. So lama le lamisni chayav ala Shane, you don't have to teach that. That's already been taught. Hatana le reisha, already said in the reisha, kol shu rishus le nizik v'lo le mazik, that if it's the rishus of the nizik and not the mazik, chayav akol is chayav and everything. The karen b'chatzar hashutfin, and if you're saying that the chiddush over here is that as far as karen, it's chatzar hashutfin because both are allowed to bring in their oxen. Hatana le reisha, but that also is already taught in the reisha. It said earlier, kagon chatzar hashutfin v'habika. If you have an area of shutfin or a valley or the area of the plains, al hanegicha v'al hanegifa tam mishalim chatzi nezek. It already said that by negicha and negifa the tam pays chatzi nezek, so it's already included in the earlier rules. You're just designing essentially an area which follows some rules for Shane and some rules for Karen, which we've already discussed, and therefore isn't that a problem to explain Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar in that fashion? And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Yadalid Amud Beis.